Someone tested you today. You probably did not notice. It was not a confrontation. It was not an argument. It was not anything that would show up in a conversation about conflict or disrespect. It was smaller than that, quieter than that. And precisely because it was small and quiet, it was far more revealing than any open challenge could ever be. Maybe they arrived late and watched to see if you would say something. Maybe they interrupted you mid-sentence and watched to see if you would hold your point or let it go. Maybe they made a request that was slightly outside what you had agreed to and watched to see if you would push back or quietly comply. Maybe they gave you a compliment that was just slightly backhanded and watched to see if you would accept it at face value or notice the edge underneath it. Whatever form it took, the test had one purpose: to find out where your boundaries actually are, not where you say they are, not where you imply they are, where they actually are when pressure is applied. And the result of that test, whether you passed or failed, whether you even knew you were being tested, updated their internal assessment of who you are and how much power you actually hold in their world. Machiavelli wrote about this with a precision that most people find uncomfortable because it removes the comfortable idea that relationships are built on trust and goodwill alone. He said that every person in your life, from your closest ally to your most casual acquaintance, is continuously running assessments of your strength, not because they are malicious, but because the social world requires everyone to know where everyone else actually stands. And the only way to find out where someone stands is to apply pressure and observe the response. This video is about what those tests look like, why they happen, and exactly how to respond to them in a way that builds rather than erodes the foundation of your power. Part 1. Why everyone tests everyone, 1:30 to 4:30. Before we go into the specific tests, you need to understand why testing happens at all. Because if you understand the root, you will recognize the branches every time they appear. Human beings are social animals operating in a hierarchy, whether they acknowledge that hierarchy or not. Every relationship you have carries an implicit power dynamic, not a brutal domination dynamic, not a master and servant arrangement, but a dynamic that answers the question of whose reality tends to shape the shared space between you, whose preferences carry more weight in decisions, whose time is treated as more valuable, whose boundaries are observed without question, and whose are tested to find where they actually end, whose emotional state sets the tone of the room and whose adapts to the room's tone. These questions are answered not through conversation, but through behavior, and the answers are continuously updated through observation of how each person responds when pressure is applied. Machiavelli understood that this process is not optional. It is not something that happens only in toxic relationships or with malicious people. It happens in every relationship because it is the natural mechanism through which social beings establish and maintain their understanding of the relational landscape around them. A new colleague who does not yet know how you operate will probe, not aggressively, just observationally. They will make a slightly unreasonable request and watch how you handle it. They will take credit for something minor and watch whether you notice and whether you respond. They will test your reaction to interruption and to being overlooked and to having your time treated casually. None of this makes them a bad person. It makes them a human being doing what human beings do when they need to understand the terrain they are operating in. The problem is not that the testing happens. The problem is that most people go through their entire lives being tested without knowing it, responding to each test as if it were the individual situation it presents itself as, rather than the power assessment it actually is. The person who understands that the test is happening has an enormous advantage over the person who does not because they can cheat the test, but because they can respond to what is actually being asked rather than just the surface situation. Machiavelli was very precise about this. He said the prince who does not understand that he is being continuously assessed will eventually find himself in a position he did not choose and cannot explain because he walked into it through 1,000 small moments he did not recognize as significant. The 1,000 small moments are the tests, and they begin earlier and run deeper than most people want to believe. Part 2. The 7 most common power tests. Let us go into the specific tests, the ones happening around you right now that you may have been interpreting as something else entirely. Test 1. The lateness test. Someone who wants to assess your position in their hierarchy will arrive late. Not always dramatically late, sometimes just slightly late, just enough to see what happens. If you say nothing and adjust your plans around their timing without comment, they have learned something. They have learned that your time is negotiable, that the implicit contract of a scheduled meeting can be altered unilaterally without consequence, that you will absorb the cost of their disregard without making it visible. And the next time will be slightly later, not because they are calculating exactly, but because the first test produced no resistance and the behavioral boundary adjusted accordingly. Machiavelli wrote about the danger of allowing small violations to pass without response. He said that a prince who ignores minor transgressions teaches his court that major ones are worth attempting. The size of the transgression is not the issue. The presence or absence of a response is. How to pass this test. You do not need to be aggressive or dramatic. You simply need to make the cost visible without theater. When they arrive late, you say clearly and without hostility that you have had to adjust your schedule and that going forward the agreed time is the time you will begin. You say it once, you say it calmly, and then you follow through. If they are late again, you begin without them. The behavior communicates the boundary more effectively than any amount of explaining. Test 2, the interruption test. They speak over you, not constantly, just occasionally, just enough to observe whether you stop speaking when they do or whether you hold your thread. If you stop every time they interrupt you, they have learned that your contribution to a shared space can be overridden simply by inserting sound into it, that you will yield conversational territory when it is claimed. If you hold your thread, not aggressively, not with raised volume, simply continuing to speak at the same pace and tone until you have completed your point, they learn something very different. They learn that your voice in a shared space has weight that does not dissolve when challenged. How to pass this test. Do not stop speaking when interrupted. Do not raise your voice. Do not address the interruption directly. Simply continue your sentence at the same pace and volume and complete the thought. Then pause and acknowledge their point. The sequence matters. Your point completes first. Their interruption is received second. The order establishes whose contribution takes precedence without a single word about power. Test 3, the unreasonable request test. They ask for something that is slightly outside the established agreement. Not dramatically outside, slightly, just enough to see whether you will quietly accommodate or whether you will hold the line. The request might be professional. Can you handle this extra task that is technically outside your scope? The request might be personal. Can you change your plans at the last minute because something came up for them? The request might be relational. Can you make an exception to something you clearly established as a boundary? If you say yes automatically without negotiation, they have learned that your stated parameters are softer than presented, that applying the right framing to a request can expand what you will do beyond what you indicated. If you respond to the request by clearly acknowledging it and then either holding the line or negotiating explicitly and on your own terms, they have learned that your parameters are real. How to pass this test. Do not say yes automatically and do not say no aggressively. Name what is being asked clearly. If it is outside your scope or your agreement, say so directly and without apology. If there is room for negotiation, define the terms of that negotiation yourself rather than accepting theirs. The key is that your response makes it visible that you notice what was being asked rather than simply absorbing it as if it were normal. Test 4, the emotional temperature test. They arrive in a particular emotional state and observe whether the room adjusts to their emotional temperature or maintains its own. The person who is in a bad mood and watches to see whether you become cautious, appeasing, subdued, more careful in your word choices, is testing whether your emotional state is dependent on theirs, whether you read their energy and recalibrate accordingly. If you do adjust, if your tone becomes softer, your manner more careful, your energy more accommodating when their mood is low or their tension is high, they have learned that their emotional state is a tool that affects your behavior, and whether they consciously intend it or not, that knowledge will be used. How to pass this test. Maintain your own emotional temperature regardless of theirs, not coldly, not with deliberate indifference, but with the grounded consistency of someone whose internal state is not a function of the room's mood. Acknowledge their state if appropriate. Ask if they are all right. But do not allow their emotional weather to become your emotional weather. The person who holds their own temperature in the presence of another's volatility is communicating something profound about where their center is. Test 5. The public contradiction. Test. They contradict something you said in front of others, not privately, publicly, and they watch to see whether you defend your position, immediately concede, or try to find middle ground that splits the difference and satisfies no one. The immediate concession tells the audience and the person testing you that your stated positions are not firm, that the right social pressure at the right moment can cause you to abandon what you said. The aggressive defense tells the audience that you cannot tolerate being challenged and that your position requires protection rather than possessing inherent strength. The graceful hold is the pass, acknowledging the challenge with genuine consideration, stating clearly that you have heard their point and considered it, and then maintaining your position if it holds, or updating it explicitly based on their logic rather than their social pressure. Machiavelli was precise about this. He said a ruler who changes his position under social pressure rather than under logical persuasion teaches his court that pressure is more effective than argument. And a court that knows pressure works will apply it constantly. How to pass this test? When publicly contradicted, pause before responding. The pause itself communicates that you are not rattled. Then acknowledge the specific point of disagreement. Then restate your position with its underlying reasoning made explicit. If their argument is genuinely strong, update your position and say so, and say why. If it is not strong, hold your position and say why. The key distinction is that your response is driven by logic, not by the social discomfort of being contradicted in front of others. Test 6. The favor economy. Test. They ask for a favor and watch not just whether you grant it, but how you grant it. Whether you grant it with conditions and clarity, or whether you grant it with the eager energy of someone who needs to be useful to them. The eager, unconditional grant tells them that the favor economy between you runs in one direction, that you can be drawn upon freely without negotiation and without reciprocity being made visible. How to pass this test? Grant favors when you choose to grant them with the calm ease of someone who is choosing to give, rather than the anxious energy of someone who needs to be needed. Do not attach strings artificially, but do not suppress the natural expectation of a functional, reciprocal relationship. If reciprocity is not happening over time, name it directly and without drama. The person who can name an imbalance without emotional charge around it is communicating a level of self-awareness and groundedness that is itself a form of power. Test 7. The information. Probe test. They share something with you or ask you something that is designed to see how much of yourself you reveal under mild social pressure. How much you disclose when someone shows friendly interest. How quickly you fill silence with information about yourself. How much of your inner world becomes available when someone leans toward you with apparent warmth. The person who reveals too much too quickly under the influence of apparent warmth and attention has shown that their inner world can be accessed relatively cheaply, that social warmth is sufficient collateral for significant disclosure. Machiavelli wrote that the prince who reveals too much of his thinking to those around him has given them the architecture of his decisions before he has made them. And a man whose decision-making architecture is public is a man who can be predicted, managed, and in some cases preempted. How to pass this test? Cultivate the discipline of receiving warmth and attention without treating it as a transaction that requires reciprocal disclosure. Ask questions, be genuinely interested in others, be warm and engaged and present, but develop the distinction between genuine connection, which deepens slowly over demonstrated trustworthiness, and social performance of connection, which presents the appearance of intimacy to see what it unlocks. Part 3. The psychology of the tester. Now let us look at the person running these tests, because understanding who tests and why will dramatically improve your ability to recognize the tests when they happen. Most people who test others are not doing it with conscious malice. They are not sitting alone plotting how to assess your power. The testing is in most cases an automatic social behavior driven by need rather than strategy. What needs drive it? The need for certainty in relationships. People need to know where they stand with others and where others stand relative to them. Testing is the mechanism through which this certainty is established and maintained. The need for safety. Paradoxically, people sometimes test the boundaries of those they care about most, not to find weakness they can exploit, but to confirm that the person has enough internal structure to hold a relationship steady. A person who finds no limits in you is not reassured. They are made anxious. The limits are the evidence of structure. The structure is what makes you trustworthy. The need for respect. Some people test because they have been in relationships where their time and boundaries were not respected, and they need to know whether this new relationship will replicate that pattern. Their testing is protective. And yes, some people test from a position of wanting to locate weaknesses they can use. These people exist. Machiavelli would not pretend otherwise. But they are a smaller category than the anxiety would suggest. And the response to all categories of testing is the same regardless of the motive behind it. Maintain your center. Make your limits visible without theater. Respond to the test rather than the surface presentation. Machiavelli made a distinction that is useful here. He said there is a difference between a subject who tests from loyalty and a subject who tests from ambition. The loyal tester needs to confirm your strength to feel secure in following you. The ambitious tester is looking for an opening. The response to both is identical. Hold your ground with calm consistency. The loyal tester is reassured. The ambitious tester finds no opening and recalculates. Your response does not need to differentiate between them. The same groundedness serves both situations. Part 4. What failing tests actually costs you? $1,500 to $1,800. Let us be clear about what is actually at stake here, because some people will hear this and think they are being asked to play games or perform strength they do not feel, and that misses the point entirely. When you consistently fail power tests, you are not just losing social points in a game that does not matter. You are shaping the actual reality of every relationship you inhabit. Here is what failing tests actually produces over time. First, it produces relationships where your needs are systematically treated as secondary, not because the people around you are cruel, but because you have trained them through your responses that your needs flex when pressure is applied. They are not ignoring your needs. They are operating on the information you provided about how negotiable those needs are. Second, it produces a self-image that erodes silently. Every time you fail a test and know it on some level, every time you leave a conversation or a situation having absorbed something you should have named, there is a small internal registration of that moment. Not always conscious, but present, and accumulated over time. That registration shapes how you see yourself in relation to others. Third, it produces the particular exhaustion of someone who is carrying more than their share of every relationship they are in. The person whose boundaries flex absorbs the costs that firm limits would have distributed more evenly. Over time, that absorption becomes a weight that colors everything. Machiavelli wrote that a prince who allows the erosion of his position does not lose it in a single dramatic moment. He loses it across 100 small moments that individually seem manageable and collectively produce a position he cannot recover from without a rupture that costs more than it would have cost to hold the position in the first place. The cost of holding your ground in the moment of a test is almost always smaller than the cost of reclaiming ground you have already conceded. That is the Machiavellian calculation, not cruelty, not aggression, just an honest accounting of what small, consistent yielding actually produces over time. Part 5. The difference between power and aggression. This is the section that most people who think about power get wrong. And getting it wrong produces something worse than powerlessness. It produces the performance of power that reads as insecurity to everyone watching. Machiavelli was not describing aggression when he wrote about the prince maintaining his position. He was describing something much more difficult and much more effective than aggression. He was describing groundedness. Aggression is a response to feeling threatened. It is loud precisely because it is not secure. It draws attention to the challenge because the challenger has gotten inside the defended perimeter. It requires the other person to back down in order for the aggressive person to feel okay, which means the aggressive person's internal state is dependent on the other person's response, which means the aggressive person is not actually in a position of power. They are in a position of reactivity. Groundedness is different. The grounded response to a test does not require the other person to back down. It simply holds its own position, regardless of what the other person does. The grounded person who is interrupted continues their point, not because they need the interrupter to stop, but because their contribution to the space does not require permission to exist. The grounded person who is contradicted publicly does not need the contradiction to be withdrawn. They simply restate their reasoning with clarity and hold their position if it holds. Their internal stability is not threatened by the challenge, which means the challenge does not produce the rattled response that challenges are often designed to produce. This distinction is everything. The person who responds to tests with aggression is communicating that the tests are working, that the challenge is landing, that there is something inside that needs defending because it is not stable enough to stand on its own. The person who responds with groundedness is communicating that the test simply bounced off something solid, not because they perform solidity, but because the solidity is real. Machiavelli understood that real power does not need to announce itself. It is visible in the quality of stillness at the center of a person who has been challenged and has not moved. Not because they could not be moved, but because what they are standing on does not require the challenge to fail in order to remain standing. That quality of stillness is what every test is ultimately trying to find, and when it finds it, the testing stops. Not because the tester decided to be kind, but because the information has been gathered and it confirms something that makes further testing unnecessary. You are solid, and solid ground does not need to be tested repeatedly. Part 6. How to build the foundation that passes tests automatically. Everything in this video so far has been about responding to tests, but Machiavelli would insist that the higher level work is not in the response. It is in the foundation that makes the right response natural rather than performed. Because performed groundedness can be detected. It has a quality of effort to it, a slight tension, a monitoring quality, that observant people can feel even when they cannot name it. And performed groundedness under sufficient pressure eventually breaks and reveals what it was covering. Real groundedness cannot be broken because there is nothing behind it that is different from what is on the surface. What you see is what is there. The test hits it and the response is consistent because the internal and external are aligned. How do you build this foundation? The first element is clarity about your own values and non-negotiables, not as a list you have made intellectually, but as a living knowledge of what you will and will not do regardless of the social cost. Most people have never actually identified where their real limits are. They discover them reactively when something pushes past them and they finally respond. Building the foundation means doing this work proactively, knowing before the test arrives what you are holding and what you are willing to negotiate. Machiavelli wrote that, "A prince who does not know his own mind cannot project a consistent face to his court, and a court that sees inconsistency in the prince will test constantly because the inconsistency signals that the right pressure at the right moment might produce a different result." Knowing your own mind is the foundation everything else is built on. The second element is the practice of completing your thoughts before responding to others. Most people respond before they have fully thought. The response is driven by the social urgency of the moment, rather than by their own actual position on the matter. Building the habit of the pause, a real pause, not a performed one, before responding trains your system to produce responses from a centered place rather than a reactive one. The third element is reducing your need for approval from any single source. The person whose sense of self is heavily weighted toward any one relationship or any one context is vulnerable to testing from that source in a way they would not be if their foundation were broader. When your sense of who you are and what you are worth is distributed across your own assessment of yourself, your work, your relationships, your values, and your history, no single test from any single source can threaten the whole structure. The test hits one part of the structure and the rest holds. The fourth element is the willingness to let relationships recalibrate when you begin holding your ground more consistently. Some relationships have been built on a version of you that was more yielding. When you begin passing tests that you previously failed, some people in your life will push back. Not always consciously, but the dynamic they were comfortable with is changing, and human beings resist change in relational dynamics even when the change is healthy. This recalibration period is the most important and most challenging part of the work, because the pushback can feel like evidence that you are doing something wrong, that you are being too rigid, that you should go back to the version of yourself that kept things smooth. Machiavelli would tell you to hold through this period. He said that the prince who changes course every time his court expresses displeasure has taught his court that displeasure is the most effective tool available to them, and a court that knows displeasure works will deploy it constantly. Hold through the discomfort of the recalibration. The relationships that are real will adjust. The ones that depended entirely on your yielding will reveal themselves in the adjustment. And that revelation, painful as it is in the short term, is information you needed. Part 7. Winning every time without fighting, 2330 to 2430. The title of this video promises that you can win every test every time. And now you understand what winning actually means. It does not mean defeating the tester. It does not mean making them feel the weight of their challenge or demonstrating to them that you cannot be pushed. It does not mean aggression or coldness or the performance of strength. Winning every test means responding from such a consistent and grounded internal position that the test simply finds solid ground and reports back. Every time. The person who wins every test is not the person who never gets challenged. They are the person whose challenges consistently meet the same quality of response. Calm, clear, unhurried, rooted. Machiavelli's ultimate insight about power was not about dominance, it was about consistency. He said the prince who is consistent produces in his court a predictability that itself becomes a form of protection. When people know that testing will consistently find the same solid ground, they stop testing for weakness. They begin operating on the assumption that the ground is solid, and that assumption reshapes every interaction. You do not win once and establish your power permanently. You win consistently and let the consistency do the work of establishing it permanently. That is not exhausting when the foundation is real. Because when the foundation is real, the consistent response is not a performance. It is just who you are, and who you are cannot be tested out of you. Someone will test you today. Now you know what to look for. Now you know what they are actually asking beneath the surface of whatever they present. Now you know that the test is not personal and not malicious in most cases. It is simply the social world doing what it has always done, applying pressure to find out where the solid ground is. Your only job is to be the solid ground, not the performance of solid ground, not the aggressive defense of ground that feels threatened, but the actual thing, the real foundation that was built through the slow and unglamorous work of knowing yourself, holding your limits, and responding to tests from a place deep enough that the response and the person are the same thing. Machiavelli ended his observations about power not with a celebration of those who hold it, but with a warning to those who mistake the appearance of it for the substance. The appearance of power is defeated by sufficient pressure. The substance of it absorbs pressure and remains. Do the work to build the substance, and you will never need to worry about winning the test because winning will simply be what happens when you show up as who you actually are. The tests will come. They always come. Be the kind of person that tests bounce off of. That is the only strategy that works every time.